In a country once defined by its billions, there came a time when one birth too many was a crime. The year is 1978. China has just emerged from the ashes of Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution, a decade of chaos that tore through families, traditions, and faith. The people are exhausted, and the government is desperate. Famine, poverty, and overpopulation haunt every province like shadows that refuse to die. China was hungry, not just for food, but for control. In Beijing, 1978, the capital hums with a quiet anxiety. Deng Xiaoping, China's new pragmatic leader, stands at the edge of a nation that is both broken and overflowing. In villages, families still cling to the old belief that more children meant more hands, more labor, more survival. But in the eyes of the new government, those same children now represented mouths that the nation could not feed. By the late 1970s, China's population had surpassed 970 million. The fear was not of invasion, nor rebellion, but of its own people. Behind closed doors, government advisors, scientists, and economists began drafting what would soon become one of the most ambitious and ruthless social experiments in human history. We see a dimly lit conference room in Beijing. Charts line the walls, with population graphs climbing like mountains, red ink bleeding across the paper. One man steps forward, Song Jian, a military scientist and mathematician. Educated in Moscow, Song believed in the precision of numbers. He wasn't a politician. He was an engineer who saw humanity as a data problem to be solved. He calmly stated, "If we continue at this rate, our population will reach 1.4 billion by the year 2000. Our resources cannot bear that weight." His solution was radical, one that would reduce the future to a formula, a policy of strict population control, limiting families to only one child. The idea took hold like wildfire, not because it was kind, but because it promised stability. Deng Xiaoping listens. To him, progress meant order, and order meant control. The country was on the brink of transformation, opening to the world, rebuilding its economy, but only if it could contain its people. He quietly believed, to get rich is glorious, but too many mouths make glory impossible. And so, in the name of modernization, the government began crafting what it called the family planning policy. At first it was voluntary. Propaganda posters encouraged families to have fewer children. Late marriage, late birth, one is enough. Bright red posters showed smiling parents with one child, the model of modern Chinese prosperity. But soon, persuasion turned to pressure. Voluntary became mandatory, advice became command, and the home became the state's battlefield. By 1980, the policy was officially enforced. Across China's cities, local party officials received quotas. Each province, each town, even each village had to meet population targets. To fail meant punishment. To succeed meant promotion. The result was a nationwide network of surveillance and control. In every hospital, every school, every factory, the state's eyes watched the womb. Government family planning officers visited homes unannounced. Women were registered, monitored, and categorized. Pregnancies required permission. Marriage licenses came with birth permits. In rural areas, whispers began, stories of resistance, fear, and loss. Some families hid pregnancies in silence, moving between villages at night. Others bribed local officials for false certificates. But the system was designed to catch them all. While fear spread in the countryside, the cities were flooded with slogans of hope. Billboards read, "One child is best, for the nation, for the future, for you." Government TV programs painted the picture of a better life. Parents of one child living in modern apartments, their child educated, healthy, and bright. In schools, children were taught patriotic songs praising the policy. Thank the party for only child love. The campaign was total, psychological as much as political. And yet, beneath the surface, a deep unease grew. In the farmlands of Anhui and Sichuan, where traditions ran deep, the policy met its first real defiance. To a farmer, children were not a burden. They were survival. But orders from above were absolute. Local cadres enforced sterilizations, imposed fines, and confiscated property. The policy that began as numbers on a chart was now lived in fear, whispered behind closed doors. In small villages, rumors spread about mobile teams, government squads sent to enforce compliance. Entire villages would go silent when the trucks arrived. But for every family broken, another hid in the shadows, determined to protect what the state had forbidden. By the mid-1980s, China's population control machine was in full motion. Every pregnancy was registered. Every woman was marked. The greatest control is not through fear of death, but fear of discovery. The state claimed success: lower birth rates, economic growth, and social harmony. But the human cost was buried deep, unspoken, undocumented, unacknowledged. Internationally, the world praised China's discipline. Global organizations cited it as an example of modernization. But those who lived beneath it knew another truth: that progress had come at the price of privacy, motherhood, and choice. Inside the Ministry of Health, data analysts began noticing irregularities: sudden drops in registered births, unexplained medical records, unaccounted disappearances. But these files were sealed, marked internal only. Control had turned into concealment, and concealment was power. By 1989, as protests shook Tiananmen Square demanding freedom and reform, a different kind of silence gripped the countryside. One not of students and slogans, but of families too afraid to speak. The government doubled down. Population control is national defense, one official declared. The policy was no longer just an experiment. It had become ideology. In the span of a single decade, a nation had turned its most natural act, birth, into a matter of state. We see a soft wind pass over empty fields, and the camera pans across villages where generations once thrived, now quieter, smaller, restrained. They called it progress. They called it policy. But for millions, it was the beginning of silence. This is only the beginning of a story that shaped modern China in ways we are still trying proudly to the charts. On paper, it was a success. In reality, it was control at an unimaginable scale. Each province had a population and family planning commission, a bureaucratic machine that reached into every household. Local officials carried thick ledgers filled with handwritten data, family names, marriage dates, and most critically, pregnancies. These officials weren't just record keepers. They were enforcers. Their job was to ensure that every birth was approved, and that no second child saw the light of day without permission. Those who disobeyed faced what were known as social compensation fees, fines so large they could erase a family as savings overnight. The price of a second child was not measured in love, but in money. Propaganda continued to shine brightly. Billboards displayed smiling families with slogans like, "One is enough, for a stronger tomorrow." But beneath the cheerful posters, a quiet tension pulsed through everyday life. Women carried birth permits like identity cards. Factories and offices kept fertility files for female workers, monitoring menstrual cycles and marriage dates under the guise of national duty. Every woman became part of the system. Every pregnancy, a matter of state. In hospitals, nurses whispered. In villages, rumors spread. Officials visited homes at dawn, counting heads, checking records. A mother once said in a hidden interview, "You never forgot you were being watched, not by a person, but by the policy itself." In big cities like Beijing and Shanghai, many families complied. Education and jobs demanded mobility, and one child meant opportunity. But in the countryside, the policy cut deeper. Traditional families depended on children for labor, care, and legacy, especially sons, who carried the family name. In the villages, the one-child policy clashed not with numbers, but with nature. Some provinces quietly allowed exceptions: 2 children if the first was a girl, or if the family lived in certain ethnic minority regions. But the line between permission and punishment was thin, and often determined by the power of one's connections. Bribes whispered in envelopes, promises made behind closed doors. A parallel system thrived beneath the official one. Control breeds not order, but corruption. As the policy hardened, resistance began to grow, quietly and invisibly. Midwives and doctors in small towns sometimes looked the other way, helping families hide pregnancies. Some families fled to the mountains or neighboring provinces, living under false names. Underground networks formed, not of rebellion, but but of survival. Wherever there is control, there is defiance, not in noise, but in whispers. In remote areas, entire generations of hidden children were born, unregistered, unseen, without identity papers. They couldn't attend school, get jobs, or marry legally. They lived between worlds, existing yet invisible. A haunting silence surrounded them. Inside government offices, reports piled up. Birth data, enforcement statistics, compliance rates, every figure was presented as evidence of success. But the truth was far more complicated. Officials faced impossible quotas: keep population growth below a certain number or face demotion. This pressure created a culture of falsification, altered records, destroyed documents, and manipulated statistics. When truth becomes dangerous, numbers become lies. Those who questioned the policy from within were silenced. A few sociologists and scholars warned of future consequences: an aging population, a gender imbalance, widespread mental trauma. But their voices were buried under political pride. To challenge the policy was to challenge progress itself. Throughout the 1990s, a silent demographic shift took place. Families desperate for sons led to a widespread gender imbalance, creating an entire generation where boys vastly outnumbered girls. In a society built on balance, the scales began to tilt. By the late 1990s, villages reported strange patterns. Classrooms filled mostly with boys, while baby girls were conspicuously fewer. The consequences weren't immediate, but they were irreversible. As years passed, this imbalance began to reshape society. Loneliness, fierce competition for marriage, and an unspoken grief that lingered in the hearts of millions. As China opened its economy to the world, international journalists and human rights observers began asking questions. Reports emerged, quiet at first, then louder, about the human cost of China's rapid modernization. Yet the government defended its policy fiercely. An official stated in archival footage, "Our policy has prevented 400 million births. It has saved our economy. It has secured our future." The global community remained divided. Some praised China's population control as a model of discipline. Others saw it as a violation of basic human rights. In a world chasing growth, morality often comes second. As the decade drew to a close, a new social phenomenon emerged: the Little Emperor syndrome. Children born under the one-child policy were showered with attention and resources, the sole hope of their parents and grandparents. 4 elders, 2 parents, 1 child. This 4-2-1 family structure became the symbol of modern China. The generation of one carried both privilege and pressure. These children were raised to excel, to study harder, achieve higher, and carry the dreams of an entire lineage. But behind the pride was quiet isolation. Many grew up without siblings, without the shared laughter of childhood. Their world was smaller, their burdens heavier. Sociologists called them the lonely heirs of a national decision. By the late 1990s, economic prosperity had transformed China's cities, but new challenges began to surface. Factories faced labor shortages. Rural communities struggled as the younger generation moved to cities. And beneath the statistics, something deeper stirred: guilt. Officials who once enforced the policy began to question its cost. Doctors, now older, reflected on the years of silence they were forced to keep. Every system built on fear eventually turns inward and begins to fear itself. The policy that once unified the government now carried an invisible weight: moral exhaustion. The 1990s were the decade of discipline, when 1 billion people learned to obey not through violence, but through silence. But beneath the order, cracks were forming, cracks that no statistic could hide. The world was changing, the people were awakening. And soon, even the architects of control would begin to lose their grip. The world saw China's miracle, its booming cities, its unstoppable growth. But behind the miracle, there was a generation growing older, and another that was never born. The new millennium promised progress, but beneath its surface, the shadows of a past policy began to lengthen. China entered the 2000s with pride, a rising power, a symbol of modern success. But hidden within that pride were ghost numbers, unregistered children, families living with forged papers, and countless lives that existed off the record. Decades of control had rewritten the country's family tree. Entire branches were missing, erased, quietly, systematically. Government records estimated over 13 million people lived without a legal identity, the Hai-Haisi, or black children. They weren't criminals. They were invisible. They couldn't go to school, couldn't apply for jobs, couldn't even legally exist. In a country built on numbers, they were the ones who didn't count. By this time, the earliest generation of one-child families had grown old. Parents who once obeyed the policy's strict rules found themselves alone, with one child left to care for 2 aging parents and 4 grandparents. The promise was prosperity. The reality was pressure. These only children became known as the 4-2-1 generation. 4 grandparents, 2 parents, 1 child, a single, fragile link holding up an entire family line. When accidents or illness struck, families faced unthinkable loneliness. The concept of shidu parents, those who had lost their only child, entered China's vocabulary. For them, there was no second chance, no next generation, no one to carry their name. The tragedy of control is not just in the act, but in the aftermath. Inside government offices, whispers of doubt began to rise. Younger officials, born during the one-child era, started asking quiet questions. Was it worth it? Had the policy gone too far? And what happens when a nation grows old before it grows rich? Economists warned of an aging crisis. By 2005, China's working-age population began to shrink faster than anyone expected. The pyramid of progress was turning upside down. For years, the government had controlled the cradle. Now, it was running out of workers to fill the factories. The very factories that had once overflowed with young laborers struggled to find recruits. The nation that once feared too many births now quietly feared too few. Urban China was changing fast. Skyscrapers, digital revolutions, global trade. But in the heart of its cities lived a generation raised in solitude. They were the children of control, disciplined, ambitious, and alone. Psychologists began to study a new social phenomenon: loneliness in a land of abundance. Without siblings, these young adults faced pressure from all sides, to succeed, to marry, to provide for their aging parents. The term Little Emperor Syndrome evolved into something darker, a generation struggling with isolation, anxiety, and a fractured sense of identity. They had everything their parents never did, except perhaps a certain kind of freedom. By the late 2000s, foreign media and human rights groups once again began to question China's population policy. While the government defended its historical necessity, an internal debate had already begun. Scientists, economists, and even party advisors started voicing their concerns. The unthinkable was being thought. Could the one-child policy, once called a triumph of governance, become its greatest mistake? Behind closed doors, demographic reports revealed alarming truths. The population was aging rapidly. The gender imbalance had reached crisis levels, with over 30 million more men than women. And birth rates were falling far below the replacement level needed to sustain a population. The policy had achieved its goal, but maybe too well. China's future prosperity depended on its youth, yet the youth were disappearing. In the digital age, even silence found its voice. In villages, elders spoke with nostalgia for the larger families of their youth. In cities, couples whispered about wanting a second child, not as an act of rebellion, but as a form of redemption. Social media, though tightly controlled, became a new battlefield. Posts and blogs began to circulate stories of loneliness, regret, and quiet defiance. One viral message read, "We were born alone, raised alone, and now we must raise the nation alone." Young couples questioned why they should obey a rule created by their grandparents' generation. The government, long accustomed to obedience, faced a new kind of resistance. Peaceful, logical, and increasingly difficult to silence. Meanwhile, in universities, demographers warned of an impending population cliff. Professor Yi Fuxian from the University of Wisconsin published a controversial paper arguing that China's birth rate had already dropped far below sustainable levels. At first, he was dismissed and accused of exaggeration. But soon, even the government's own statistics began to align with his warnings. The truth, buried for decades under layers of loyalty and fear, was finally surfacing. The government began its own internal reviews. Quietly, they discussed possible reforms, allowing 2 children, easing restrictions, restoring some sense of balance. But no announcement was made just yet. Change in China often moves not in leaps, but in whispers. By 2010, the contradictions had become impossible to ignore. Hospitals and schools faced declining enrollments. Real estate developers noticed an eerie trend. Fewer families were buying larger homes. The birth wards that had once overflowed with new life were now eerily quiet. The echo of control was emptiness. The country's leadership faced an internal reckoning. The very policy that had secured stability for decades was now threatening the foundation of the economy. One anonymous official was quoted as saying, "We were afraid of having too many people. Now we are afraid of having none." The first official signal came in 2013. China announced that couples could have 2 children, but only if one parent was an only child themselves. It was a cautious, calculated move. A test, not a total transformation. After 3 decades of absolute control, the first crack appeared, small but irreversible. Surprisingly, the public response was muted. Many couples didn't rush to have a second child. The cost of living, housing, and education had soared. Generations conditioned to think one is enough found it difficult to imagine more. The cage had been opened, but the birds no longer remembered how to fly. As the decade drew to a close, filmmakers, writers, and scholars began exploring the human side of the one-child era. Documentaries like One Child Nation gained international recognition, peeling back decades of silence. Through personal testimonies, the world saw what numbers could never show: the emotional weight of obedience, the quiet strength of those who endured, and the hidden pain of those who enforced the rules. History had not ended. It had only gone unspoken. For the first time, public debate touched the untouchable. Even state media began to acknowledge the long-term challenges caused by strict family planning. And so, the tide began to turn. Not through revolution, but through realization. For 30 years, China had controlled life itself, who could be born and who could not. But the cost of control was time, and time, once lost, cannot be replaced. The numbers had fallen. The economy had risen. But somewhere between progress and power, a part of humanity had been forgotten. Every policy is born from fear, and every fear, one day, must face the truth. The city glows under the pale haze of dawn. The streets hum with quiet efficiency. The air is still, heavy, as if holding its breath. For 35 years, the one-child policy ruled every family, every birth, every heartbeat in China. But by 2015, even the architects of control could no longer ignore what their creation had become. In the early 2010s, China's economy stood tall, the world's factory, its second-largest economy. But beneath the glitter of success, the population graphs began to bend. Birth rates dropped, the workforce shrank, and the elderly population surged, faster than in any country in modern history. The same policy that had once been championed for saving the nation from poverty was now pushing it toward a steep decline. By 2014, more than 200 million people were over the age of 60. Hospitals struggled with elder care. Pensions ran thin. And for every aging parent, there was often only one child to shoulder the burden. Economists began to whisper a forbidden phrase: demographic collapse. The government, which had once feared a population explosion, was now facing the extinction of its own growth. Inside the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, the party's leadership gathered. Charts and projections covered the room, all pointing to the same stark conclusion. China's population was no longer its strength. It was becoming its greatest weakness. For the first time in decades, the guardians of control began to question their own control. Behind the scenes, advisors pushed for change. One of the strongest voices was Li Keqiang, China's premier, who quietly urged that the policy had outlived its usefulness. Others feared chaos. What if lifting the rule led to instability? This debate wasn't about compassion, it was about survival. Even mercy, in a system built on obedience, must first be justified by necessity. Then, on October 29, 2015, a single headline rippled across China and the world. China ends one-child policy. All couples allowed 2 children. State media announced the decision calmly, almost mechanically. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the pain caused. It was just a quiet revision, as if rewriting history were as simple as changing a line of text. After 35 years of strict control, freedom returned not with a roar, but with a whisper. Families reacted with a mix of disbelief and celebration, but others, especially the younger generation, hesitated. They had lived their entire lives under a single rule, and freedom, after so long, felt foreign. The government expected a baby boom. It never came. The cage was open, but the birds did not fly. Many couples chose not to have more children, not because they didn't want to, but because they simply couldn't afford to. Housing, education, and healthcare costs had skyrocketed. Urban life was competitive, exhausting, and incredibly expensive. For the first time, China faced a paradox. People were free to have children, but they no longer wanted them. As one sociologist put it, "We taught a generation that one was enough. Now, we ask them to unlearn what we made law." By 2018, the birth rate had fallen to its lowest level since the Great Famine. The government grew alarmed. In 2021, another headline broke. 3-child policy announced. It was an act of desperation, a reversal so rapid it stunned the world. After 4 decades of restriction, China was now pleading for births. But again, the people didn't respond. The pendulum had swung from control to panic. Years of economic pressure and cultural change had reshaped the very meaning of family. Women who had been told their worth was in obedience now sought independence. Couples who once feared punishment now feared poverty. You cannot undo a generation's fear by decree. Freedom cannot be commanded. It must be felt. As the years passed, the world began to learn more about what had been hidden. Documentaries, memoirs, and interviews with former officials revealed the inner machinery of the policy, the enforcement tactics, the propaganda, the lies buried in statistics. For decades, silence had been loyalty. Now, truth was a form of redemption. Some local officials publicly expressed remorse. Doctors spoke of moral wounds they could never heal. Even some policymakers admitted that the policy's success had come at an unbearable human cost. But there was no trial, no public apology, no national reckoning, only quiet reflection, hidden behind the language of historic necessity. When a nation builds its future on control, who dares to confess the cost? Today, in the 2020s, China faces the long shadow of its decision. The lonely generation of only children has become the core of the workforce, pressured, burdened, and exhausted. They care for aging parents while raising their own children, forming the new 4-2-1 family model. 4 grandparents, 2 parents, and 1 child holding it all together. They were born to obey, and grew up to repair what obedience destroyed. In rural villages, homes once filled with children stand empty. In cities, playgrounds grow quieter each year. By 2023, the population officially began to shrink, for the first time since the Great Leap Forward. The story had come full circle. In a deeply ironic twist, the Chinese government now campaigns for larger families. Billboards that once said, "One is enough," now read, "Have 2, have 3, for the future of our nation." Cash incentives, tax breaks, and extended maternity leave are all being offered in the hope of reversing what decades of control had done. But trust, once broken, is not rebuilt by slogans. The people no longer obey out of fear, and they no longer believe in promises. The government can change laws overnight, but it takes generations to change a culture. The policy may have ended on paper, but in the hearts of millions, its shadow remains. Many of the policymakers who created and enforced the one-child policy have since retired or passed away. Song Jian, the scientist whose cold calculations helped start it all, later defended his role, saying he had only followed data, not ideology. But history has a longer memory than numbers. Some legacies are measured not in achievements, but in absences. Deng Xiaoping's dream of modernization was fulfilled. China rose to global power, but the system he built came at the cost of something priceless, the natural rhythm of human life. Progress had been achieved, but at what price, and to what end? The camera pans across a modern city skyline. Drones hum, neon lights flicker, and below, a mother walks hand in hand with her daughter. The world has changed, and yet, a quiet question lingers in the air. Can a nation built on control ever truly learn to trust its people? As the wind passes through empty swings in a park, a whisper remains. The one-child policy ended in 2015. But the silence it created may echo for generations. In the end, history is not written by those who rule, but by those
The
who
case
remember.
may be closed, but criminology never sleeps. Like and subscribe at Join Criminology and step deeper into the dark with us.